Okay, this is Julian Ricci with QSPNLive.com, and I'm here today with our current mayor here in Philipsburg, Montana, Daniel Reddish, and Michelle Risho. And we're doing Tea Talk today with the mayor about Philipsburg. So welcome.
Hello, Philipsburg.
Hello, Philipsburg.
Greetings.
And thanks for visiting us today, Daniel. And I'm going to turn it over to you, Michelle.
Okay, this is exciting. Daniel, we've known each other since, I think it was 2006 or 5 or something.
Somewhere
like
in the early 2000s.
We go back.
Yeah.
So it's really nice to be in your company.
Very nice to see you again. It's been a while.
Yeah, and things have happened for you.
Well, things aren't static in my life, that's for sure, which is the way we like it. We like forward movement. We like to proceed in an orderly manner and get things done. So
Can we start? Okay, so we're going to do orderly manner.
Okay.
We're going to start with, I'm curious about your childhood, what things happened that inspired you to become the person you are today, and what led you to feel that you were the right person for the job as mayor of Philipsburg.
Well, I'd like to start early on. I was born in the great state of Ohio. It was one of these classic Roman Catholic families, pretty big. 6 sisters to be exact. I grew up with 5 girls, only boy in the house. There was definite pros and cons to that. I was active in sports, just a regular middle-class kid who loved the outdoors. Knew at an early age, probably 6 or 7, didn't know what I wanted to do, but I knew whatever it was, I wanted to be outside. And that's a big gamut there. That could be from soccer player to gravedigger, but it had to be outside. And so that's what I predicated most of my decisions on, through Boy Scouts and camping and spending all of my time outside. That grew into a real desire for me to orient my lifestyle that way, even as a child. And my parents, of course, having 5 kids at 25, I guess I had the advantage. You can imagine that, right?
5 kids at 25.
Right, and that
Catholic family?
Catholic, okay. Right, and in that classic 1950s way of doing things, we were all named with the first letter. So my sisters run from Denise, Doreen, Deborah, Dawn, Dan, Daniel, and my mother would be on that, of course. And so that was a very active environment. My parents.
What were your dogs' names?
I don't. Yeah, we didn't have any dogs. No,
I can see why.
Not much room. I always got my own bedroom though. You know, the girls, they stacked like cordwood in the 2 other bedrooms. I never saw the bathroom until I was a junior in high school. Hand-me-downs for a little, slumber parties rock, though. I like slumber parties. So anyway, that was my childhood. It was crazy, a lot of activity, a lot of outdoor activity. I remember one instance on a Sunday night when it was getting dark and my parents telling me, you have to come in and take a bath, there's school tomorrow, and me screaming that, I hate you, I'm going to go live in the woods. I returned later to find the front door locked, a blanket on the porch and a clothesline, and a note that said, go to the backyard and start now. So my parents were always, they were advocates. They always said, you want to do that? Here's a lunch and a roadmap, go do it. Having gone through that and being raised that way, well, long story short, situations change, families change. I wound up one day, shortly after my 16th birthday, out on my own. So I left home at 16, knew where I was coming, and that was Montana. And I came out to Montana in my late teens, established myself, based mostly on a lifestyle that I was looking for. And then I, in turn, fit my career into the lifestyle. I suppose that's socially dyslexic in a way. Most people get a career and then they do the other thing. I traveled all over the country and came back to Montana and decided to live here full-time in 1979, 80, about 1980. So.
What was it about Montana as opposed to the other regions of the U.S. that drew you here?
Strictly demographic. Country the size of France with about 800,000 people was a big thing, which to me afforded me opportunity in terms of freedom and freedom of expression, your ability to quote-unquote do your own thing. Usually it helps in those instances to be in an area where there's not a dense population center. So that was a big part of it. the weather, the wildlife, the environment, everything to me. Often in my first few years in Montana, when I would leave the state, I would come back at a tradition, and I did this often coming back from Idaho, of stopping once I was inside the state line, getting out of the car and looking around and then kissing the ground, because I thought in many regards, they'll never let me back in, because I felt as though this was a positive form of internal exile, if you will, in a positive sense, that I felt free in Montana. I felt as though I could express myself in a certain way, and I've never looked back since then.
Now, I want to, okay, go ahead. What did you want to say?
Go ahead.
Oh, I just know a little bit about your experience with martial arts. I want to ask you how you got into training and how that has influenced your career and where you are today.
Well, that's an interesting question. I was very athletic as a kid, and I was involved in all sorts of sports. And at about age 14, I started to play judo, and I was pretty good at it, and I kept after it, doing among some other things. And the years just passed. I got out of it for a few years, and then decided I wanted to re-engage in martial arts in a really full-fledged, mature manner. And in 1989, I had the opportunity to join a taekwondo club that was establishing here in Philipsburg. That would be Young Taekwondo, which is based out of Butte, part of the Butte Karate Club, which traces its origins back to Grandmaster Park Jae-ho, who lives in Los Angeles, a Korean ultimate ninth Dan master. And his style of Taekwondo was very traditional. There was a lot of homework, and what I mean by homework is literally homework, reading historical art oriented toward more the traditional sense. In the martial arts involved much more than the physical aspect of it. And so I felt the opportunity to engage in that was really good for me, because there is a cerebral part of myself that also lent itself to this style of martial arts. It was this very effective martial arts. So I went through a process of about 20 years working with the local school, from becoming a student to an instructor, and ended up getting my second Dan, or my second degree black belt, in 2002, I believe it was. A lot of that has to do with my instructor, a man by the name of Mr. Skip Jervis, who lives in Anaconda, who was just the world to me for a long time, and very instrumental in my development. And then our personal master, Martin in Butte, was also instrumental in that. In 1992, I was training and won the Big Sky Judo Championships, which was a prerequisite for the Western Regionals that were in BC that year. And unfortunately, I had an injury, and it took me off of the path for a while. But then I got back into it, and it remains a big impact in my life. And it really is a determinant on how my administrative role is played out in terms of being the mayor and my approach to life generally. I don't like to qualify myself in the sense of giving myself a definition, but the Taoist approach would be the closest I would be to some sort of philosophical definition of the way that I observe life.
Tell me about that. What's the Taoist perspective?
That would be a situation where I would examine the extremes of anything, and I would try to find the central point of that, and then approach solving problems from that manner. A little from this side, a little from that side, see what works, see what doesn't work out, and then aim for the middle zone, because in that tradition, that is the way that life works in gravity. There's cause and effect, there's light and dark, there's big and small, there's all this myriad of opposites that are part of the physical reality, and what you strive for in the martial arts is to find the center of that and exist in the center of that. In terms of processing the material environment right down to people, it's a way of looking at things that is applicable to everything in the material world, basically. Often in the West, people think of the middle way as passive. Well, there's nothing passive about it. It's where all the activity actually happens. It's the exchange of energy, and that's something I learned in years of martial arts that I apply to all my social settings. All the time. I'm always on that. It is my lens, essentially.
So this, yeah. I want to say this is a great segue into...
Well, your career, and if I may.
Oh, go ahead. I know where I'm.
Because this does reflect in your ability, Daniel, to look at the particular projects going on in town, and to be able to look at them from a, because there is such a pendulum swing of how you can look at it. You've got one aspect saying, oh, well, this is $1 billion project, and in another aspect you've got, well, this is a town of 900 people. And how do you make it work with all of the moving parts so that it's feasible for the town to do something to improve its infrastructure without bankrupting the town? And Daniel has a knack of figuring that out.
Good job. Yeah, thank you for that. And I want to
If I may say so
this
myself.
is a good segue into the state of Philipsburg. Would you like to speak about that?
Well, sure. Yeah, absolutely. With respect to just briefly what Julian was talking about in learning to move things around, the first thing you learn is how to duck.
Right.
Okay. Very important thing. Correct. And that's that's just a metaphor for the way that I approach everything. Philipsburg is let's just back up here a second. Obviously, in the U.S., Montana is an incredibly unique place, and we love it. In that context of Montana being unique, Philipsburg is really unique. So there are dozens and dozens and dozens of towns in our state that are approximately the same size, somewhat of the same history, some of the layout, the demographically, even the physical characteristics are similar. However, Philipsburg itself is still profoundly unique. Its history is unique. The way that it's laid out is unique. There's an energy here, I think, that is still tangible frontier energy. In other words, the beauty of the demographic here is you have an 1,800 square mile county approximately with 3,000 people in it. That's less than 2 people per square mile. There's only 2 counties in Montana that are like that. There's some downside of that. You don't have much of a tax base. The upside of that is that what that means is that a small amount of creative people can have a big effect. And so our town, I'm sure 120 years ago when people came here, they looked at it in the same manner where they said, there's opportunity here. You might have to work your butt off to get it, but there is opportunity here if you are willing to work hard and create and be creative and create things. I believe that spirit is intact today, absolutely. The exterior has changed. It's gone through the normal boom and bust cycles, and perhaps we're now coming out of a recent bust cycle, I'd like to believe. But the spirit of the place has been consistent all the way through, in my estimation. That's been my personal experience to it. So with respect to what's going on in Philipsburg, 35 years ago here, the town was mostly boarded up. We just come out of the early 80s. Most of the mines were closing down in the 70s. What was left was, at that time, was approximately 4 to 6 local sawmills. Those have all subsequently closed. And in that process, like a lot of other small Montana towns, there's that anguish or that thought that it's over. Well, it's never over because the energy doesn't go anywhere, it just transforms. It may lay dormant for a while, but it certainly isn't gone. And what I've experienced is, over the last 20 years in particular, the right groups of people have moved into here that have been self-motivated, self-creative, and helped to initiate a turn. And that's where we're at right now. We're in that point of turning, making the transition, I think, obviously somewhat out of the resource-based economy into some other economy. I'm not sure what that is how it's going to manifest itself eventually. Obviously, there's some tourism, there's some tech stuff that's going on that is good in the nature of what we're doing right here. Would be a perfect example. This wasn't a possibility even a few years ago. So if we're going to reference that, you folks sitting here talking to me in this living room is a characterization of what I mean about creative people, given a little technology, and most importantly for me, given the freedom to express themselves. I think this is a very fertile environment for that. That sounds sort of subjective and pie in the sky. But I will tell you this too. This is another one of my characteristics. Is not exclusively in martial arts, but I had occupations that were very physical and demanding. I'm here to tell you I've experienced 18 broken bones. I am not a pacifist. I'm a peaceifist. I'm an arm to the teeth peaceifist, but I'm a peaceifist, okay? What I mean by that is I don't sit around, and my attitude is, given the opportunity, you can turn lemons into lemonade.
Right, exactly.
If you're not afraid to fail.
Adapt.
Exactly. And so I feel, I know that this environment in Philipsburg today, although on the outside economically seems somewhat challenged, and maybe in some people's opinions somewhat culturally challenged, but the opportunity is limitless here.
Yeah.
And it is based on some of the demographic realities that lend themselves to opportunity. Again, like I'm saying, a small amount of people has some drawbacks, but it also has some definite benefits if you're willing to adapt to it.
Can we talk about your favorite, what you're most drawn towards when you speak about the opportunities? What are the opportunities that you're most excited about? I know you mentioned the technology infrastructure. Are there any other booming things that are up and coming?
Before you answered that, there's been, over the past few years, there's been a lot of change in the town getting really engaged in repairing the infrastructure.
Right.
And, clearing the water line, for example, to the Fred Burr line, and getting things spruced back up in good condition. And there's been a lot of excitement around seeing that happen, and this man really taking the charge and the drive behind it.
Yeah, let's talk about that.
So tell me a little bit about the transition from where, you came onto the council, about 7 years?
6 years.
6 years ago.
Right. Yeah.
So
what drew you to the council?
And
what drew me to the council?
and then your transition of watching this growth that's coming out, from there today.
Okay. This is an interesting irony. I've always been political, a political animal. I'm political by nature. I even in my profession, in my sports, and everything in the past, I've always existed in a group dynamic or a team dynamic or a cast or a crew or however you want to say it. So I thrive in that. I've never, in my occupations or otherwise, ever pointed and said, go do this. I'm like, come on, let's go do this. So the leadership quality, I think, is there. But in my own estimation, people, they want leadership, but they want accountability. Anybody can lead and then not be accountable. You have to have accountability. With respect to the town in the recent past and what's going on now, this dovetails back to my conversation about possibilities here and what creative people can do. And I'll give you an example. Over the last 20 years, the right individuals or the right groups of people have purchased private infrastructure here downtown and renovated it. And we have what we have now, which is phenomenal restoration process that's occurred. And it's occurred in an environment where it wasn't overly regulated and people didn't come and dictate and say, you have to do this, this, and this. Individuals came here, or people were born and raised here and purchased buildings, for example, who would never change anything other than to make it safe and better. They love the way that it is. And so, talking with the state about our infrastructure, for example, I often use this case. They say to us, wow, you guys are doing great down there. These are folks in Helena. You guys are all over the place. You're all over media. We're hearing about you. You're winning all these awards. And I have to say, well, it's kind of a mile wide and an inch deep in some respects. A completely refurbished and beautiful 1890s facade is wonderful. 1890s sewer, not so much. So I've taken it as part of my mission to make sure that everyone is aware of what's happening below our feet. And I mean that literally, is that all the hard work and the energy and the money that's gone into refurbishing town, just below the town, the infrastructure, obviously sewer and water, are probably the single most important issue right now. And in terms of local government and what people's expectations are for local government, for me, it's public safety. And public safety to me, clean water and making sure wastewater is dealt with correctly, that is public safety to me. Everyone knows observable, the police, law enforcement, the sheriff, we need that. However, that's just one component of public safety. Public safety, again, to me, is making sure the water's clean and the bad water goes away and is dealt with properly. So when I look at it, to me, that's the first rung of government. That's the most important thing that particularly local governments do, is provide a safe environment. And from there out, everything on top of that, depending on how high up the ladder you want to climb, eventually you're going to go from the main cupcake into the icing. And there's a lot of icing out there. And I don't feel that this town is in a position where we can provide a lot of icing, if you will. We have to take care of the basic infrastructure. That's our mandate. It's the single most important thing we do as elected representatives. And so that's been my primary focus. With respect to the way the town works and some of the changes, now here's an example, the icing, as I put it, parks and various programs and this sort of thing. We have very proactive philanthropic organizations here. We have very proactive people who do volunteer work. And so what I've done is my best is to sort of push those things together. What do the people want that I consider icing on the cake? How can I go around the normal budget system to try to get these things provided and get the people involved? And that's what we're doing right now. We just finished an improvement to our ice skating rink that was done by a private organization, the Philipsburg Ice Association. They got a grant to do refrigeration and so forth. All this was done by private organizations. The flip side is we have a local active Rotary Club that was instrumental in putting the park together initially. They just finished a stage on the north side of the ice rink. We have another individual group, the Philipsburg Trail Association, Granite Creek Trail Association. They were able to secure some grants recently. We just put a new half-mile walking trail through the park. We're going to do, I spoke with Paul Babb at Northwest Energy. He secured me $3,000. We're going to plant some trees at the end of September in the park. All of this has been done off the budget. I'm not going around and moving money around in the budget and try to take, rob Peter to pay Paul type of thing. My responsibility is the public safety. If folks want more, then they need to come to talk to me and let's figure out a plan on how to do it.
And this is an example of community coming together.
Yeah.
And Philipsburg has a history of this, of organizations coming together and working together to create change and create things to happen and make improvements.
And I will add really quickly to that, again, I keep reiterating this, that is one of the advantages of having a small population density in the sense that there isn't a lot of regulatory oversight. And while obviously you want to do the lawful, responsible things, all that stuff becomes bogged down by the bureaucratic red tape, if you will. And if we can minimize the red tape because we just don't have it here, then that's a straighter line to me.
So we mentioned projects that are ongoing and people, philanthropic organizations that are helping out. Are there opportunities for, if anyone's inspired right now while listening to you speak about how wonderful it is to see a city thrive or a hamlet thrive,
right,
such as Philipsburg, and they want to help out in some way or aspect, what are the things that are the needs of the community that have yet to be met or addressed?
Well, there's the obvious infrastructure needs, which are predominantly hooked up with the government. It's government's responsibility to do that, and the local government, the state government, and so forth. There are other things, I would say, affordable housing. There's some interesting ironies in here because we've had an influx of folks coming in, and we have supposedly, from what I've been told, a housing shortage, and yet upwards of 25% of the houses aren't lived in. And so there's just some anomalous stuff that comes with that. I think that people can have affordable, decent housing in terms of characterizing a need. I would say that's pretty high right now.
And who would be living? What's the demographic of folks who would be living in these affordable housing structures?
Well, okay. I want to be clear about this. when I say affordable housing, I don't mean a housing project that is just that affordable, and maybe that's what you want to do. That's not what I mean at the time. I mean, I don't want to get in the way.
Can I say?
Yeah.
See, there's a culture here. There's quite a employment staff that works at the ranch at Rock Creek, and then there's also the Forestry Service. So there's a mix and an influx of people, and they turn over and they stay. Some of them stay, and some of them
seasonal housing.
Yeah, and Philipsburg doesn't have enough sustainable housing to really grow beyond.
For the service industry or the Forest Service.
Right. And in the past, for many years before the ranch, for example, or VoteSmart, or some of these organizations that moved in the last 20 years, before that, say go back to the late 90s, if you looked at the employment demographic and you added, say, the town employees, the county employees, the state employees, the federal employees, including the teachers, now you're pushing 70% of the employment. 67% of the employment is either local government, county government, state government, or federal government. And I believe when I read those stats, at that time they hadn't put the teachers in, which are essentially state. So of course, I'll bet you at that time it wasn't too dissimilar to a lot of small towns in Montana, where you have a county that's 68% federal ground, right? Mm-hmm. So back in the day, there was the opportunity to go and do resource-based jobs in that 68% of the county. The dynamic has changed. Those jobs aren't here anymore. Why they went away and should they come back, that's a whole other conversation. I'm not entirely convinced that they're never coming back. I'm just saying that that transition has happened, and in that process, there's some organizations that have moved in, as Julian referenced the ranch at Rock Creek. You're talking 100 plus employees. Probably
178 to 200.
Probably, yeah. I was going to say in the season, it could be double that. So think of that in terms of, say, 150 employees in a county of 3,000.
Yeah, it's significant.
That's 5% of right there of the obviously they're the largest employer, and you got to throw in the Forest Service.
Yeah,
in that.
which is almost doubles that again in the summer and the season.
The needs, and I could name some other basic needs in that mix, of course, is childcare, for instance. I think that these are places that if someone were to set up shop, I think they would do really well, right? There's an immediate need for that sort of thing. The other thing that's interesting here is we're the classic summer place where it rock and rolls for 90 days of the year, and you can't find a parking space, and so there's been talk and consideration of possibly exploiting that money-wise in a different manner. For example, a resort tax has been talked about a little bit. However, on a Tuesday night in February at 7 o'clock in the evening, we could walk up and down the street, and there's not a lot going on. You can't
even with Discovery nearby.
Right, and in my opinion, and Discovery is a bump. It's a positive thing. It's a great ski area. It's all good. It's tough though when you ski and you leave the slope at 4 or 4:30. The chances are you're not staying here.
Okay.
So if Discovery, for example, in my opinion, if they had lights in the slopes closed at 10, then I think Tom would change somewhat. It would have a bigger impact. Not to suggest that the hotels and the BRVOs aren't filled up with ski people, because they are, right? So there's definitely an impact there. It's just very quiet in the evening on a weekday in the middle of the winter.
So you've identified childcare,
right,
and affordable housing,
right.
Are there any other opportunities that potential viewers, if they feel excited about helping Philipsburg out and growing in a positive direction, they might have something to do with it? Right.
I if I could wave my magic wand, I would make Philipsburg the museum capital of Montana.
Tell us about that.
I would take every arcane concept you could think of. The Montana Museum of Masks, the Montana Museum, the International Museum of Sledding. I would put 25 museums.
Museums do really good here.
And it's my aesthetic, obviously, but I think conceptually it would really work. I'd go to the International Museum of Sledding just to see what a Norwegian toboggan look. You see what I'm saying? I'm a concept person, and so if I could do something like that. Now, let me also say that part of that I sense for this town is there are a lot of active, working, successful artists that live here. Again, there's not a lot of people, but relative to the population there is. My wife is a perfect example. She has a flourishing jewelry business. She's a jewelry designer. She spent 20 years on the road packing up the motorhome and going to the next place. She'll walk 2 blocks from the house to the post office, put 4 small boxes in the mail. One will go to South Africa, one will go to London, one will go to Tokyo, and one will go to Sydney. So in that sense, that's another example of the technology allowing you to choose a lifestyle base that isn't necessarily, couldn't have been done in the past, basically, right? So that's another thing. Anyone who can do, like, I keep it to you guys, right?
This is very interesting. If we look at Philipsburg's history with mining, and then going to logging, and now we look at the opportunity with technology infrastructure expansion. It opens up a whole new aspect and a whole new era of prosperity for the area and the region that it didn't have, and in a new way that it never had before.
This is really important for me to just kind of jump onto what you're saying in this sense that when you say the mining and the logging and so on and so forth, that's the history, 120, 150 years of extractive industries. And I know from what I speak here, since I was in the land restoration business for 38 years and I planted over 2 million trees, we don't have to leave the woods. We don't have to say, well, we're closing up shop. We're not going back into the forest anymore. It's just to look at and have fun in. Quite to the contrary, we're at the beginning of massive restoration, excuse me, period of restoration. We're coming out of a century of extraction. Now, over the last 3 decades, we're up and running with the restorative or the restoration or the remediation of the environment, which is, if folks want to still get out there, they want to do good works, they want to be outside, they want to have occupations that matter, the land restoration business is booming.
It is. Look at the Stacks in Anaconda. They just had their 100th celebration, and they're doing
we're surrounded. Excuse me, I'll give you an example. In 1978, Jimmy Carter signed the Superfund legislation passed in 1978 to accommodate these bad environmental messes. It took 30 years for that thing to
catch up,
to actually be allocated. 30 years of litigation from 1978 to 2008. They signed the consent decrees, and when those were signed, Missoula County got over $100 million. Butte Silver Bowl got $100 million. Anaconda Deer Lodge got $50, $60, $70 million
for remediation.
For remediation on Superfund sites. Now remember, Butte is the largest historical district in the country, superimposed over the largest Superfund site.
Right.
So I was involved with the Milltown restoration, 5 years doing all the re-veg on that, and then I was involved with the restoration business. We did all the re-veg on Butte Silver Bowl Creek over 14 years.
Wow.
That was the largest creek reconstruction in the world. It ran from Butte all the way to Opportunity. They dug up all the garbage, they remediated it, they put the creek, and at that time in Missoula it was the Clark Fork River, into a canal around the impacted area. They got everything out of there. The hydrologists came in, recontoured the river, let it come back in. We came in afterward, built 6 miles worth of bioengineered, willow reinforced riverbank, planted millions and millions of wetland species in there. Long story short, there's a lot of opportunity in the restoration business right where we're at, right here in Granite County, in Powell County, Deer Lodge County, Butte Silver Bowl, obviously. So with Montana Tech being there, for example, there's more of the science side of it also that's available. So I think any land-oriented stuff is still happening. It's just made a transition in terms of the approach.
So we've covered, I'm just going to recap what we've covered so far. We've talked about economic development, public safety, infrastructure, and technology. Have we talked about the budget yet?
The budget specifically for town, we're just finalizing that this year, and our budget is approximately $1.2 million. I would say probably upwards of close to 70% of that goes into public works. So there's not a lot of stuff that happens beyond public works. It's just a tremendous amount of emphasis on that. Our budget numbers are pretty sound. Revenue expenditures are matching. We're doing okay. Again, I think that the bottom line is trying to find revenue.
And the diverse opportunities to create that revenue that you need to do the other projects that you know the county needs.
Yes, and I'm also in the 6 years discovered quite a bit about governmental budgeting that I don't know the best way to say this.
It's a process.
It's a real complicated process.
Yes, very complicated.
And some stuff doesn't make any sense. And something that you might score out in the real world as a deficit, it may be scored as an asset in the government world. It's just a strange way of bookkeeping.
Well, then look at how they did LT2. I mean, or how LT2 should have been done from the beginning properly. Well, they have, because it's a government funded project. There's all these there's these funding agencies, and then there's regulatory agencies, and then there's contractors, and then there's, in this case, Philipsburg became its own contractor and was the only town, I believe, in Montana to ever get that designation. And then there is all of the engineers, and so there's all these moving parts, and there's a normal process of doing all of this that keeps all of the numbers, all of the wages. See, you've got one kind of wage here and one kind of wage here because you're paying different people, and then you've got Davis-Bacon wages, which are wages that you have to pay because you're having federal funding. And there's all these elements that just go into, they just keep going, that have to be accounted for. And a town this small is unequipped in normal sense to keep up with all of that.
Has anyone developed software for that yet?
Well, I'm sure they have, but we had to finally make that work with the limited resource that we didn't have.
I'm sure that was a struggle.
And it was a struggle to...
It's one thing to say, okay, we know our fixed costs. We also can anticipate some of these things. We better be cautious over here and plan something out that works fairly well. What you can't anticipate sometimes is when mandates come down from above that you didn't have an expectation for. And I'll give you a great example here. Philipsburg is extremely unique in the sense that we also have town property that constitutes about 2,700 acres of a watershed above town. And 85% of our town water comes from two high mountain lakes, and it's gravity fed down a 7-mile long pipeline into town, which is essentially what I refer to as our umbilical cord. It's 85% of our water.
You see it as you drive in.
Right, and so, for example, you have to treat that water. However, that water wasn't, and I'm talking about disinfecting the water, right? For example, fundamental way would be chlorine or gas clarification and so forth. For many years, let me just state, the water is incredibly clean. It's really clean. There's the mechanisms for disinfection, but there's also a mechanism for filtering. Those are two separate things. Because we have surface water, right? For example, we have to treat it with chlorine. And I suppose you could go up there with a cup and stick it in the lake and it would be fine. There's really nothing wrong with the water. It's so clean. But again, the regulatory process comes down and says this is public health and safety. You have to chlorinate it. So they started chlorinating the water probably 3 decades ago or so. Here's the glitch, is that we have a source of municipal water that's surface water. It's coming from a lake. There's many, many places in the U.S. that do the same thing, much bigger cities than here. I believe Portland might have a surface water source for their municipal water. So consequently, not only disinfection, they have to engage in heavy filtration. Well, the town of Philipsburg has one of only 2 filtration waivers left in the continental U.S. for surface water because our water is so clean. So we, as of yet, have not been mandated to use a filtration process on our water. However, when you're given that variance, you're subject to regulatory nuances and so on and so forth. So as it turns out, we have this waiver for a decade, everything's fine, our water's fine, it's working good. Then the federal government comes down and says, oh, you have a surface water waiver, you need a second form of disinfection, or we'll take your waiver from you. So this is an example of what I mean by some stuff you can't really predict, and then you have to work hard and fast and hit the ground running and figure out how you're going to get this done and how you can get the money for it. And Julian and I had that experience when he referred to the LT2 plan, which that is correct. So we got this mandate to do a second form of disinfection, and we chose to go with the UV. It's really good, works really well. And so we went through about a 3-year process of running around trying to find money for that, and going through engineers and dealing with all that local stuff. It doesn't. The water hasn't changed in any regard. It's as clean as it ever was. But again, that's just an example of you say on the wastewater side, we know what we have to do. We have to start saving money. We have to find grants. We have to make a plan. And then this thing comes sideways at you. Well, what do you mean? We have to stop that for 3 years? Why we get a second form of disinfection? And let me tell you, this is another irony in this. If we have to go to filtration, if we lose our filtration waiver, when they do measurements for water filtration, they have something called a log system, which works on a grades on a curve, because the anticipation is there's always some form of material water. Ours is so pure that it wouldn't pass the purity test. Does that make sense?
No.
Of course it makes no sense at all, because the purity test is setting on an assumptive grade angle that says there's something in there. Well, there isn't anything in there. So, and this is a regulatory irony that is very difficult for me as an elected individual to explain to our customers why are our rates so high. It's really tough to say, the problem is we have too much water and it's too clean. Wow. You know what I mean? They'll get the pitchforks out. It doesn't make any sense, but I'm giving this as an example of some of the peculiarities of working inside government.
Okay.
Where you're just like, now how am I going to deal with this? I need a whole new skill set to work on this.
Now we're talking about the inner workings of your daily job. Can we talk about that? What does it look like to be mayor on a daily basis? You wake up in the morning with Cynthia. Hi, Cynthia. And you go to work. What does that look like?
Well, I guess logistically it's pretty easy for me because I live a block from the office.
Right.
So that's fine. I'm getting in there. Again, it's been a transition for me a little bit because I spent 38 years out in the forest working outside, doing vicious, hard physical labor, and in all of that, aside from a period of time where I had an accident, my body never hurt. Sitting at a desk, my back's killing me. So I'm getting up and I'm walking around more in the office and dictating to myself. I'm not sitting as much. That's been a determination made over the last 6 months. I get in there, I touch base with my clerks, I find out what's on their agenda for the day, then I start coordinating. I coordinate with the Public Works Director and Public Works crew. I see what's coming up. I establish agendas for upcoming meetings. I set scheduling for meetings. I chair meetings.
Make phone calls.
I talk a lot on the phone, email a lot, text a lot. So it is like sort of an administrative coordinating type of thing, which is interesting for me because, again, in the 6 years I've been involved in the public as an elected representative are probably the least political 6 years of my life. There's really no time for politics. There's no time to talk about philosophy and the way it is and the way that it might be. It's 90% of it's administration. Okay. It's like running a giant camp in a way or something. I need a whistle. It would be good. And so
he needs a whistle.
Yeah.
The whistle.
Yeah, right. So
maybe
and it is
a whistle making company that moves to Philipsburg.
Yeah, exactly. That's an iconic toy there, right?
Yeah.
One of the oldest ones around. So that's a lot of it. I'm dealing with the public, obviously. 90% of that has to do with someone's got a problem, for instance. And I've also noticed that people who end up often engaged in government that get onto a council, if you dig far enough into their background, you realize at some point in time they were the ones in the audience going like this. And that was sort of my sojourn too. wanted to know why certain things weren't done a certain way, and some questions I never had answered and probably never will. But I've learned a lot about why things are done a certain way, and you just have to get some view from the inside, I guess. My days are, again, it's a lot about scheduling, and then given the nature of our situation here, infrastructure-wise, for example, there's a lot of troubleshooting and making sure that what's going to happen next. In other words, I can plan a full 8 hours worth of work, and it could be broken up 3 times by some event that wasn't planned for. So I like to say every day is like Christmas around here.
Okay, when you say Christmas, I think of lights.
I know, all right.
And so I'm thinking about lights right now. And you made a comment before we went on the air about the shining light, and I would like for you to expand upon what the conversation was earlier.
I think that gets back to my interpretation of physical reality of us as humans, and how we move through our very existence materially, in that sense that there's a tremendous amount of what I term energy, kind of a generic term, or life force, that it's my own opinion that you can plug into, if you will, and engage in that, and use it to better yourself in your community. And I don't think that is easily manifested in some places as it is in others. In other words, if you think about a battery, you got to clean the cables off. I think the cables are pretty clean here in Philipsburg. I think the access to that life force is really vibrant here for me.
It's vibrant, I was thinking.
And it's interesting because again, light is sort of a generic term. I connote life with movement, or light with movement, because particles, waveform. Everything I look at is waveform. I'm looking at you guys, and you're waveform to me. It sounds sort of esoteric, but again, it's back to my martial arts approach of negotiating energy, if you will, getting out of the way, accepting it. In martial arts, you can go like this and try to break through something, and you may not be able to do it, and eventually you just end up with a headache. At some point, you'll just go around it. And so that light manifests itself in daily activity between people and the exchange of ideas, and that's how I would interpret that.
So if somebody who's listening right now has ideas for you and wants to contact you and have a meeting with you about their ideas, how would they go about doing that?
Well, you can contact me at my office phone, which is 859-3821, and I'm in the office Monday through Thursday, generally from 8 to 2, and then on Friday from 8 till noon. I have a personal email, working email address I can give that to, and that would be redeye, REDEYE, @blackfoot.net. And I'm totally available, and I check it all the time. That's part of the new me, I guess.
Really?
Yeah.
Are you like every
Jimmy
5
did that new
minutes?
Teddy
Yeah.
Roof.
Who's texting you? Who's emailing you?
Daniel just recently got a smartphone.
That's right. Yeah, I've gone from carrier pigeons pretty fast, and my wife chides me and calls me a millennial, and all this kind of stuff.
You're an adaptee.
Yeah, I'm an adaptee, but I still have a closet full of carbon paper in case the big one hits. So yeah.
The MP.
Yeah, right.
So Daniel, we talked about, I think, everything on our list here. Although if you would like to leave with maybe a statement about cultural pride in Philipsburg, or the diversity of the people here, or maybe your mission statement for the city, or the hamlet. Can we just call it a hamlet?
That's good. Yeah,
Berg.
I like Hamlet.
Berg.
I like Hamlet.
Okay.
A Montana Berg, Hamlin.
I'm sorry. I want an inside scoop on what the mayor's conference looks like. Have you been to a mayor's conference in the state of Montana?
I have.
Okay. And have you been to the United States Conference of Mayors?
I have not.
Okay.
But that's on my bucket list.
Okay.
I would love to do that.
Okay,
Yeah.
so would you? Oh, pardon me. I'm just going to back up and
Okay.
ask you to talk about the mayor's conference in Montana.
The mayor's conference I went to last May, and it was in Polson, and it was primarily for me. It was about networking, It was about meeting other mayors and other chief executives and getting the feel for what the attitude is across the state and what their individual perspectives are, and also what it might mean for the role of mayors in small towns in the 21st century, because there's impacts and there's things building here, not all negative. Again, sitting here talking to you folks is a positive characterization of that, about opportunities for small towns. And
what was your takeaway?
My takeaway was there's a lot of really smart, motivated people in all over Montana, and some of them live in towns of 200 people. So all the way up through our, the booming metropolises of Missoula, Bozeman, and so forth. It's interesting because there's some basic, I don't want to say only problems, but there's some basic things confronting our little town here that are happening in Bozeman or that are happening in Missoula. They're just on a larger scale. And so I'm looking forward to the next one, for sure.
When is it?
There's
probably May again.
Yeah,
they're generally annually.
Right, and there's one coming up that's not the whole big comprehensive one at the end of September in Butte. That would be Montana Association of Cities and Towns.
Yeah, weeks.
You're right. Is that okay? Yeah, right. That's what that is.
Montana, a good city.
As far as my vision for the town here, what I've experienced, and Julian was a part of this too, was you're here and you'd like to go like that, and life doesn't work that way. There's swervage to get there. You just don't want to go too far out there. But what we experienced was you have to have the tools to get from A to B. You have to have a good rudder and a good compass and set your course. And in order to do that, while I often cite these problems with the infrastructure, broken sewer main, burst water main, we had a long period of time where we were having your basic clerical problems. In other words, again, we had to get the books straightened out. We had to reorient the office. It sounds really fundamental, but it is, but it doesn't work unless that stuff's taken care of. So what we've experienced over the last few years was, again, I'm going to use the sailing metaphor, we had to bring it about. We had to turn it. You don't turn the Queen Mary on a dime. You have to bring it about. And as the nature of all bureaucracies or all systems, that decisions emanate from the top. Okay, so think about this decision coming down this pyramid. And physics dictates that it's very difficult to undo a bad decision. It doesn't go up the same way. It's like throwing a rock in the water and asking the ripples to come. They're not coming back. They're going out to the end of the universe.
Right.
They're just not going to come back. So my point being is that what has transpired over the last 2 to 3 years has been instrumental in resetting the course. So now I think we're headed in the right direction, and now it's just going to be a lot of hard work to take care of the basic things that we need to take care of. And also, and I want to emphasize this too, growth is life. We wouldn't be here if there weren't for growth. Growth is necessary. It's a beautiful thing. It's life. But there is too much of a good thing. And so I want to remain aware of this in this process. In other words, I want to somehow keep it funky, if you will. I want to maintain the hamlet quality of our town. I don't want Philipsburg to turn into any other small, little, groovy Rocky Mountain town. I want to honor our past. I want to honor our resource-based past. I want everyone to acknowledge that no matter what we do here, it was lined out as a historical mining district. I want to emphasize that and make sure, again, while I'm an advocate for growth, I'm not an advocate for over-gentrification. I don't want this place to become so expensive that no one can live here. That's the last thing I want. So I want to take my 10 minutes behind the steering wheel and go, let's go over here. And then what do? You put it in park and you bow out and go do your thing. So I guess in that scenario, the best people can hope for is someone who's reasonable, of reasonable intelligence, and maybe has a moral bone in their body. Beyond that, you can't ask for much more. Nothing lasts forever. You take your opportunity to do the best you can. So, one other thing, I'm committed. I want to emphasize that. Actually, mentally, spiritually committed, but I'm emotionally detached. And
Why is that? How did you
I'm
do that?
emotionally detached in the sense that, again, I'm going to bring this full circle to the martial arts thing, that it's not that I don't care, it's just that I don't care. And when I do care, it's going to be done from an as objective as possible analysis. I call it Dr. Spock. I would like to be like Spock on Star Trek, where I'd like to address the problems and the concerns as objectively as possible, and try to minimize the subjective, emotional parts of what it means to be in public service, because that'll take you to somewhere that's not very productive ultimately. And people also feed on that, and they get the most of it out of it that they can. I've very little ego involved in this, which is another martial arts thing.
I'd like to thank you for stepping up to the plate, taking the job, and setting a new table.
Well, I appreciate that.
I really do.
I appreciate that. It is a big deal for any person who says, hey, thanks a lot. That's huge to me, because there's a lot of thankless qualities to it, right? And so it is a big thing to hear that to me. And I've always been in the opinion that I just don't throw thank yous around. I think they're an affirmation. I think they're an important thing to the universe. So I try never to be serious. The world's full of serious people, but I always try to be sincere. And that's a difference in my approach. And then I say, okay, it's your turn. So.
I also want to point out that you're an authentic person, and your character shines. And I'm inspired by you, by all your hard efforts and work in public service and in the private service, and bringing up our environment and restoration. Thank you so much. I am deeply touched by all your work.
I appreciate that.
Your friendship, and it's been a wonderful, I don't know how long we've been doing this.
Well, for a while now.
Oh, maybe an hour. We had great conversation.
Thank you for your time.
Yeah. Well, thank you.
What a wonderful time.
Yeah.
And I hope that you get a lot of comments and people reaching out to you to
Yes.
help you and the local government.
Engage the local government and take your issues to Dan.
Or if not, just get to know Daniel.
And get to know Daniel and
his wife and the
let's all
community.
work together to
Julian.
Keep making a better community.
And his puppy.
Don't overreact.
That's it.
Yeah.
Be the shining lights. Are we done?
We're done.
I think we're done.
Thank
Okay.
you, everybody.
Ta-da!
This is
Thank you.
Julian, Daniel, and Michelle signing off now with QSPNLive.com.
Tea time until next
Tea
time.
time till next time.